Welcome to this deep dive. Today, we're looking at something, well, incredibly small, actually, but it tells us surprisingly big stories. Stories about fish, yeah, but also about our ocean's health and maybe even, according to one source we're looking at, some pretty profound truths about life itself.
That's right.
We're diving into the world of fish otoliths.
Yeah, and we've got a really interesting mix of sources lined up. One set is, very much the latest scientific research, specifically this fascinating study from Nanyang Technological University, NTU. They looked at over 1,000 of these tiny ear stones.
Over 1,000. And the other source, it takes that kind of science, that detailed finding, and flips the perspective, looking at it through a completely different lens. It's a theological reflection, specifically a Christian one, asking what these biological facts might mean.
Exactly. So our mission really is to unpack the key insights from both, see what the science tells us about, fish life, their vulnerability to climate change, and then see how this one theological source interprets those same details through its lens of faith, creation, and stewardship.
Right.
It's quite a journey, honestly. We're going from this microscopic bone.
To some really big, expansive ideas. Okay, let's unpack this. What are these things? Fish otoliths.
Okay, yeah, let's start with the science basics. Otoliths, they're essentially small, hard structures in the inner ear of fish, mostly calcium carbonate.
In the inner ear,
Yep.
like for hearing?
Well, they're inside what you could think of as the sort of sound-sensing, balance-keeping bubble. So yes, they play a role in balance, maybe hearing too. But what's really remarkable, scientifically speaking, is that they function like these amazing natural data recorders for the fish's entire life.
Like a black box on an airplane. Is that the idea?
That's a great analogy. A natural biological black box, exactly. As the fish grows, so do the otoliths. They lay down these new layers, sort of like tree rings. And these layers capture information, chemical signatures, structural details about the water the fish was in, its age, how fast it grew, even potentially where it traveled. Scientists can basically read these layers.
Decode them.
Decode them, yeah. Reconstruct the fish's life story.
Yeah.
There are actually 3 pairs of otoliths, but the biggest one, called the sagitta, that's the one most often studied, and it's the focus of this NTU research.
And you said the NTU study used a really big sample, over 1,000 sagitta.
It did, yeah. Over 1,000 from 2 really important tropical snapper species, the golden snapper, Janus johni, I think is the technical name.
Right.
And the red snapper, Janus malabaricus. And they got these fish from Northwest Australia and Southeast Asia. By reading those otolith rings, they managed to reconstruct growth trends for these populations, going back at this over 40 years.
Well, over 4 decades of history locked in these tiny, bones, essentially. That's amazing. So what did they find about how the environment affects these fish?
Okay, so this is where the climate change link really starts to pop. For the golden snapper in Southeast Asia, the research showed this really strong connection between water temperature and how fast they grew.
Yeah.
Warmer water actually made them grow faster, but, and this is the key thing, only up to a certain point, an optimal point, which they figured out was around 30 degrees Celsius.
So a bit warmer is good, but there's a catch.
Absolutely. Once the temperature went above 30 degrees, growth started to slow down. And if it got above 34 degrees Celsius, growth dropped off significantly.
Why is that?
Well, it lines up with this biological principle called the temperature size rule. Basically, warmer water cranks up metabolism, which can boost growth if there's plenty of food.
Right.
But once it gets too hot, the heat itself becomes a stressor. The fish has to use energy just coping with the heat, energy that could have gone into growing.
That threshold, that 30-degree mark, sounds really critical then,
Yeah.
especially with oceans warming up. What about the fish on the Australian side? Was it?
For the Australian golden snapper, yeah, they found something else was a big factor. The Indian Ocean dipole.
The dipole,
Wow.
that's that climate pattern, right? The temperature difference across the Indian Ocean.
Exactly. It's this irregular oscillation of sea surface temperatures. And they found when the western part of the Indian Ocean was warmer than usual, these Australian golden snappers actually grew faster. Their average growth rate went up by about 8.6%.
Oh. Why would warmth way over on the western side affect fish near Australia? Seems indirect.
It does, but the suggested reason involves winds. The dipole changes wind patterns, and those winds can drive more upwelling near the Australian coast.
Upwelling. That's when deep, nutrient-rich water comes to the surface.
Precisely. It's like the deep ocean delivering a feast. More nutrients mean more plankton, more small fish.
Right.
Basically, more food for the snapper. So better food supply, better growth.
Okay, so temperature effects can be direct, through stress, or indirect, Through food supply.
Yeah.
Interesting. What else did the otoliths reveal?
Rainfall. That was another big one for the Australian golden snapper. Surprisingly, high rainfall seemed to limit their growth.
Wait, more rain was bad for fish growth. That feels backwards.
It does seem counterintuitive, doesn't it? But remember, these are saltwater fish living in coastal areas.
Ah.
So a big dump of freshwater rain changes the salinity. It kind of dilutes their environment. And dealing with that change, regulating their internal salt balance, takes energy.
Energy that could have gone into growing bigger.
Exactly. It causes stress, slows down growth. It's all recorded in those tiny rings.
It's just fascinating how many different signals get encoded. Did the red snapper show the same clear patterns?
The study mentioned that for the red snapper, the factors driving growth seemed more complex. They needed more research there. So the golden snapper gave these really clear examples, but it's not necessarily the same story for every single species. Shows you need that species-specific work.
Right. Okay, so let's tie these scientific findings together. The temperature thresholds, the dipole effect, the rainfall impact. What's the big picture takeaway from the science side, especially thinking about climate change?
Well, the major implication is, frankly, a pretty stark warning, particularly for tropical fisheries. Climate change, especially rising ocean temperatures, looks like a really significant threat.
Because even if some fish grow a bit faster initially.
Exactly. That initial boost might happen, but as temperatures keep climbing past those optimal points, the science suggests we'll see suppressed growth, smaller adult fish overall.
Which means lower catch yields.
Lower yields, yeah. And that directly impacts food supply, livelihood, especially for coastal communities, say in Southeast Asia, that really depend heavily on these fisheries.
And it's not just size, is it? You mentioned fish might move.
Right, that's the other piece. As their usual waters get too warm, fish populations might shift looking for cooler areas, which could mean they leave traditional fishing grounds behind entirely. The grounds communities have relied on, for generations. The otoliths are giving us the hard data showing just how vulnerable these systems are.
It's a powerful, sobering story told by these tiny stones.
Yeah.
Okay, let's shift gears now. Let's talk about our other source. Because it takes all this science, the otoliths as recorders, the environmental impacts, and looks at it very, very differently.
It really does. And it's important to say this theological source isn't arguing with the science. It accepts the findings. But it then asks, okay, what might these findings mean from a particular theological standpoint? It's using biblical perspectives to reflect on the natural world.
So how does it reframe something like a fish ear bone?
Well, where science sees that biological black box, this source sees something more like divine poetry or a life code. It looks at these otoliths not just as, random biological processes, but as potentially pages from God's book of creation.
Pages from God's book. How so?
The idea presented is that each ring, each layer, isn't just calcium carbonate, but a divinely tailored signature, unique to that fish, inscribed by the Creator. Reading the rings, in this view, is less like lab analysis and more like reading a tiny divine epic.
Wow.
A story of God's care and detailed design woven right into the creature. It connects this to biblical ideas like Psalm 139, about being fearfully and wonderfully made. This perspective extends that detailed craftsmanship to all creatures, even fish.
So the scientific data becomes a kind of divine script.
From this particular viewpoint, yes. The otoliths are even talked about as God's timekeepers for the fish, reflecting that biblical theme of God having a plan, a timing for everything, that every life is known. Like you read in Ecclesiastes, there's a time for everything.
That's a really different way to think about biological data. How does that perspective then shape the view of, humanity's role?
It connects directly to that concept of dominion from Genesis.
Yeah.
But, and this is crucial, this source interprets dominion not as a license to exploit, but as a sacred trust, a responsibility for careful stewardship.
Yeah.
Even using the phrase redeeming creation through responsible care.
So using the otolith science for better fishery management, that would be seen as fulfilling that stewardship role.
Precisely. The scientific insights, growth patterns, spawning locations, how ecosystems are interconnected, all revealed partly through otoliths, this source sees that as uncovering the divine architecture of creation.
And human disruption.
Human actions that mess that up, pollution, unsustainable fishing, the very things the science warns about are seen as damaging God's intricate design.
How does this source connect modern conservation, like fishing quotas or marine reserves, to biblical ideas.
It makes a really interesting parallel. It connects using scientific data for conservation to the biblical principle of the Sabbath year from Leviticus, the command to let the land rest every seventh year.
Right, yeah.
This source views conservation efforts based on science, like setting quotas from otolith data, as a modern way of allowing creation that kind of Sabbath rest, letting it recover, function according to its own God-given rhythms. It frames it as an act of faith, trusting in God's provision rather than just relentless human extraction.
That really elevates conservation, doesn't it? Beyond just pragmatism. What about the fish themselves? Does this perspective change how we should view the actual fish?
Fundamentally, yes. It emphasizes the dignity of life for all creatures. It brings in the Hebrew term nephesh.
Nephesh.
Yeah, often translated soul or living being. The source explains that biblically this term isn't just for humans. It applies to any creature with the breath of life, including fish, as Genesis mentions.
So fish have
Yeah.
nephesh. They're living beings in this view.
That's the interpretation presented, yes. Now, it's careful to distinguish this from animism. It's not saying fish are divine, but that they are living beings created by God. It means they aren't just resources or, biological machines. They're living beings fulfilling their roles in the ecosystem, what this source calls their divine mandate. Understanding their lives, their struggles against stress, like the Otoliths show, is meant to foster compassion. It links this to Christ's care for even the smallest parts of creation in the Gospels. It shifts the view from commodity to, fellow creature.
That adds a significant ethical, even spiritual dimension. How does this source see the relationship between this kind of faith perspective and the science itself? Are they in conflict?
Not at all, according to the source. It views them as complementary. Scientists doing the work decoding the otoliths are seen as interpreters of creation. By uncovering these natural laws and patterns, they are, from this theological perspective, actually revealing aspects of God's nature, his wisdom, his order, maybe even his grace. Things that Romans 1:20 says are clearly seen in what he has made.
Like finding God's fingerprint in the details, the wisdom in every scale, every ring.
Exactly like that. And it points to historical figures who thought similarly, like Thomas Aquinas, seeing God's wisdom reflected in nature, or St. Francis feeling that kinship, calling fish brothers of the water because of their shared creator.
Right.
It even brings up the ancient Christian symbol of the fish, the ichthyes, suggesting that fostering reverence for fish life, understanding its intricacy through science, can be seen as a kind of prelude to the gospel.
Wow. Okay, so we've really covered some ground. From analyzing these, tiny patterns in fish ear bones showing decades of climate impact, to interpreting those same structures as divine poetry, as God's timekeepers, as calls to faithful stewardship, seeing dignity in every fish.
That really is the synthesis this theological source offers, that the deep scientific dive doesn't have to strip away wonder or meaning. It could actually deepen theological awe and reinforce that sense of responsibility we feel when we understand how vulnerable creation is.
The science shows the urgency of climate change.
And the theology adds layers of ethical duty, rooted in that idea of a sacred trust, a faith-based call to care.
So looking at an otolith from this second perspective isn't just lab work. It's framed as encountering something almost sacred.
Yes, that's the framing, like seeing the strokes of God's brush, or finding a sort of love letter from the Creator written in the fish's life. It's a view that sees creation as inherently purposeful, cared for, and that every life, no matter how small, testifies to God's nature. Echoing verses like Psalm 8 about the heavens declaring God's glory, or Isaiah talking about God's wonderful counsel seen in creation.
And does this theological source have a specific message for the church?
It does, yeah. It calls on the church to ground its reverence for life firmly in biblical truth, citing Romans 11:36 about all things being from, through, and for God. It encourages seeing fish not just as food, but maybe as living parables of God's providence and intricate design. And the call is for this understanding to actually transform things, how the church engages with science, how individuals think about diet, how communities practice stewardship, seeing these practical acts as potential living sacrifices, reflecting God's order and mercy.
Well, this deep dive has certainly shown how zooming in on something as tiny as a fish ear bone can open up these incredibly broad perspectives, from decades of hard environmental data and the real threats we face, to these profound reflections on life, meaning, creation, and our place in it all.
Yeah, it's a powerful example, isn't it? How different lenses, different ways of knowing can reveal deeper layers in the world around us. It challenges us to really appreciate the details and think hard about our responsibilities from, well, multiple angles.
Absolutely. So perhaps here's a thought to leave you, our listeners, with drawing from both these streams. When you consider the intricate life code revealed inside a single fish otolith, what does that challenge you to rethink about your own relationship with the rest of creation? Whether you approach that question through a scientific lens, a theological one, or perhaps somewhere in between.
Thank you for listening.
See you next time.